Okay, thank you everybody for joining tonight. Sorry that we started late. We are in middle of our shiur on the tefillot of Arvit, and last week we concluded with our study of Ahavat Olam, which is a type of Birkat Torah before Keriat Shema. And tonight I wanted to continue with Emet VeEmunah. But before we jump into Emet VeEmunah, which is the second to last, the third Beracha of the brachot of Keriat Shema by night, I wanted to first discuss for a minute the topic of saying VaYomer by night. Now, there's a very famous Mishnah that everybody knows from the Haggadah Shel Pesach, and it goes like this: Maskirin Yitziat Mitzrayim Balilot. We mention Yitziat Mitzrayim by night. There's a mitzvah to mention Yitziat Mitzrayim by night. Amar B'Elazar ben Azariah, Harei ani kiven 70 shana. I am like 70 years old. V'lo zachiti shetei amar Yitziat Mitzrayim balilot. And I was never zochet to say Yitziat Mitzrayim by night. Ad shedarsha ben Zoma shneemar Lema'an tizkor et yom tzetecha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha. Right? Yemei chayecha hayamim represents the days. Kol yemei chayecha, the extra word kol, comes to include the nights. While the kol yemei includes yemot hamashiach. They disagree with the drasha ben Zoma. Now, this Mishnah is a very poorly understood Mishnah. There is a machloket rishonim and achronim exactly how to understand this Mishnah. First, what does it mean that we mention Yitziat Mitzrayim by night? Does it mean that we should say the parasha of tzitzit, to say VaYomer, which includes the mitzvah of Yitziat Mitzrayim, of Zecher Yitziat Mitzrayim, or is it talking about VeEmunah Kol Zot, which is the bracha afterwards, which has a mention of Yitziat Mitzrayim? Which one is it referring to? Furthermore, what does B'Elazar ben Azariah mean when he says V'lo zachiti shetei amar, that I never was zochet to say it? So the most likely explanation, and again, anybody is free to come and argue, because I know this is only one view in the Rishonim and Achronim, but the one I will suggest to you tonight is that the most simple way to understand this Mishnah is that this Mishnah does not mean to tell you that there's a machloket Tanaim whether or not you have to say VaYomer by night. The Mishnah in Perek Bet, Mishnah Bet, explicitly says that there is no VaYomer by night. We don't say VaYomer by Arvit. This is a Mishnah in Perek Bet, Mishnah Bet, and it is also mentioned a few times in the works of the Tanaim, like in the Sifri. So this Mishnah is not arguing about whether or not to say VaYomer. What it seems to be saying is that this Mishnah has a Misorah. We have a Misorah from the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, or something like that, that we have to mention Yitziat Mitzrayim by night. That even though the Ikar Chiyuv is by day, there is some sort of extension or dirabanan which adds a mitzvah to do it by night, whether it's dirabanan, a takana Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, something like that. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is saying, I never was able to understand why we should say it, or I never had a good enough reason to say it until I had this dirasha. That's probably the most simple way of understanding this Mishnah, simply because the works of the Tanaim always seem to assume in Eretz Yisrael, under the power of the Tanaim, that nobody ever said VaYomer by Arvit. Now, the language of the Mishnah when it discusses this is equally unclear. We look at the top of the Gemara. When the Gemara discusses this Mishnah, it says like this. Kama Amar Yosef Kama Mali Hashmaita the Kiyatar Bishmo Bar Yehuda Amar Amri b'Marava Arvit Daber b'nei Yisrael v'matalei mani Hashem Lokechem Emet. He says that in Eretz Yisrael, instead of saying VaYomer, they do an abridged version of VaYomer. Interesting. Why is that so great that they have an abridged version? Person should not begin to say VaYomer at night. But if he accidentally did, Gomer. Okay, I'll skip the meaning of that for now. Amar Papa, Kasavri b'Marava, v'Amart aleim nami lo have atchala, Ada Amar ba'Sulam Sisit. In other words, They felt it was okay to do this abridged version because they weren't mentioning the part of tzitzit, yet they were still putting in somehow a small part of this last of VaYomer. They would say, what's language again? Almost as like a zecher ba'alma, or as like a placeholder in order to introduce the next stanza of the brachot of Emet VeEmunah. Says the Gemara further, Amar Abaya, Hilkach. This should be the halacha in Bavel. Anan, atchuli matchalinan dekamatchli b'marava. We here in Bavel, we start the beginning of the parasha of Tzitzit, just like they do in Eretz Yisrael. But because we start it, we also finish it. The Hamar of Kahana Marav lo yatchil v'mitchil gomer. So because we start the beginning, therefore we do the rest, which is a very odd thing to do halachically. He's even citing Rav Kahana, which sounds like you're doing something b'di'evet. Rav Kahana says, Lo yatchil, a person should not do the third parasha. He should not say VaYomer by night. And for some reason, we do it anyway. And because we do it. It's almost like a b'di'avad. Very, very strange Gemara, but that's the halacha in Bavel. Okay. Answers. Let's go further. Amar Amar Ani Hashem Elokechem Tzarich Lomar Emet. Lo Amar Ani Hashem Elokechem Eno Tzarich Lomar Emet. Which sounds like the Gemara is saying, if a person said the parasha VaYomer, then he has to say VeEmunah Kol Zot. If he does not say the parasha VaYomer, then he doesn't have to say VeEmunah Kol Zot. Asks the Gemara, what are you talking about? The Mishnah says that you have to do Yetziat Mitzrayim by night, which sounds like, right, you have to do the Emet VeEmunah. As I explained here earlier, that the whole Mishnah is arguing about whether or not, the Mishnah is discussing where we know that there's this mitzvah to say Emet VeEmunah. Damar Hachi. So okay, instead, even if a person doesn't say VaYomer, and therefore he's patur from saying Emet VeEmunah, he says like this, an abridged version: Modim anachnu lach Hashem Elokeinu she'otzetanu me'eretz Yisrael v'utzidanu mibeit abadim v'asita lanu nisim. Praised are you, Hashem, who took us out of Mitzrayim, and you redeemed us from the house of slaves, and you did for us miracles, Gvorot al Hayam, and also acts of might over the sea. V'sharnu l'cha, and you sang to us. Which is odd. It sounds like, and Ismail Bogan suggests this. Visharnu Lucha is kind of an introduction to Mi Kamocha B'Keim Hashem Mi Kamocha Neder B'Kodesh, and then you would end with Baruch Atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael. That's what it seems to be saying here in the Gemara. That is a substitute for Emet VeEmunah. You could instead say this Modim. Okay, fascinating, odd Gemara. But this is what it seems to say, and I really shouldn't quote El Bogan. Rashi says that, but I'm just trying to explain like what Rashi's trying to say. Let's go a bit further. Now, even though the Gemara in Bavli and the Gemara in Yerushalmi both claim that in Eretz Yisrael they did an abridged version of VaYomer, the Geniza, the Cairo Geniza, has no record of this. We don't find anywhere in the Cairo Geniza that there's a manuscript from the Tefillah of Arvit where we see this abridged version of V'amarta Aleim Ani Hashem Elokechem Emet. None of the communities that are represented in the Trove, the Cairo Geniza, have such a minhag. But most of the manuscripts from the Nusach of Eretz Yisrael actually contain VaYomer. It seems that most of the communities of the Bnei Eretz Yisrael, at least the ones that were represented in Cairo, said VaYomer at night. Now, it could be that they paskind like Rabbi Zeira in the Yerushalmi, and in Yerushalmi there's a machloket whether or not they should say VaYomer, and one of the Amoraim says you should. It could be they paskind like the Amora that says you should say VaYomer by night, or the custom changed over time and they started to act like their neighbors who are the Bnei Bavel. We don't know, but the one thing we do see, we see one manuscript in the Geniza where they didn't say VaYomer, just one manuscript. We don't find the abridged version. We just find one manuscript in the Geniza where they skipped a VaYomer. So it seems to be a minority, at least in Cairo, it was a minority custom, while the Bahag testifies that in his time, which is the 9th century, because there was Shimon Kayara in the time of the Gaonim, the Bahag testifies that in his time in Eretz Yisrael, it was common for people to skip VaYomer. He doesn't say Egypt. He doesn't say, he says the Medinot, the provinces of Eretz Yisrael, people would skip VaYomer by night, as is the halacha from the Mishnah. Okay. Now I think we can continue speaking about Emet VeEmunah. So as we mentioned last week, the structure of the brachot of Keriat Shema are very similar to the structure of the brachot of Birkat Torah. There's an envelope style or a sandwich, so to speak, where you begin with a praise to Hashem that He chose us from all the nations, right? In Avat Olam, we talk about how Hashem chose us from all the nations and gave us the Torah. And then you end with a declaration of truth, an affirmation that what you said was certain and true. And this is true by the Birkat Torah, by Kriyat Torah, right? If you go to get an aliyah, you're going to say, Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu Torato. And then, when you finish, you're going to say, Hashem natan lanu Torato, Torat Emet. So too here, when we finish Kriyat Shema, we say, Emet VeEmunah kol zot. We sandwich the Kriyat Shema with two Berkot HaTorah. That's essentially how this works. And the earliest, the earliest makor for the concept of this beracha seems to be from the Mishnah that we just saw. It seems that the Mishnah has this misorah that we have to have a bracha which speaks about the Yetziat Mitzrayim by night. The reason why, we don't know. It could be an extension that the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah felt was appropriate, that every night there should be a Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, not just by Yom, but also by Leilot, like the Drasha of Ben Zoma. We don't know exactly why, but this was the Takana which filtered down. However, the Nusach, the existence of something like Emet VeEmunah is what we have to explore tonight. So first of all, and I'm sorry if I have the wrong page open. Here we go. The Tosefta gives us a clue into the contents. I'm showing you here how the Gemara in Yerushalmi quotes the Tosefta, but the Tosefta is a little bit different. It says, Tanya, Keriat Shema Baboker. The Tosefta doesn't say Baboker, means by both. Keriat Shema, Tzarich La'askir Yetziat Mitzrayim be'emet v'yatziv. He has to mention Yetziat Mitzrayim by emet v'yatziv. Rabbi Omer, tzarich laskir ba malchut. A person has to say malchut. Acherim omrim, tzarich laskir ba kriyat yamsufu makat bechorim. So Rabbi says you have to do, what do you call it? You have to mention God's sovereignty. And others say, whoever that is, or Meir, the Chachamim, that you have to also mention kriyat yamsuf and makat bechorim. Rishub and Levi Omer, tzarich laskir et kulan. We have to mention all of them. The ending of this bracha is Tzur Yisrael v'Galon. We're going to return to that in 1 second. I should mention tangentially that in the time of the Geonim, these halachot weren't followed to the strictest sense, at least not by the poetic versions. So, for example, if in the morning you would usually say Ezrat Avotenu or Ozert Avotenu if you were in Eretz Yisrael, if they would do a piyut which replaced Ezrat Avotenu or replaced Ozert Avotenu, they wouldn't mention Bechorot for some reason. We're not sure why. It could be that the Paitanim held that this mitzvah, this halacha of mentioning Makat Bechorot only applied to the nighttime instead of the morning, but it's not clear why. Now, let's get back to, besides this content of Emet VeEmunah, let's get back to how we know Emet VeEmunah exists at all. So how do we know Emet VeEmunah exists at all? We know from Rav. The Gemara says, Amar Rabba bar China nasaba mishmei Rav, kol shelo amar Emet v'yatziv shachrit, ve'emet VeEmunah arvit lo yatsa yedei chovato. Rav says like this. Rav is one of the earliest Amoraim. He's perhaps a Tana. Rav says this is the halacha. And Rav was from Eretz Yisrael, but he was paskening probably in Bavel. He says that in the morning, the Nusach should be Emet v'yatziv. And in the evening, the Nusach should be Emet VeEmunah. The pasuk says Lagida Boker Chastecha, right? And the way to remember this is that the pasuk says in the morning we remember your kindness, and in the evening we remember your faith. Emunah we mention by night. This is the only time in Shas that we mention Emet VeEmunah. This is the time of the Amoraim, and it's only mentioned by the first two words. But by the fact that Rav is calling out this prayer, and Rav is the last of the Talmidim of Rabbi Yehuda, it is most likely that this prayer existed in the time of the later Tanaim. Okay? Because Rav is being machriya, he's saying that this is what you should do. This is the nusach of the bracha of Keriat Shema that you should do. And Rav is one of the earliest Amoraim, so we must assume that Emet VeEmunah existed in the time of the Tanaim. However, none of the Mishnayot and none of the Mekorot from the earlier Tanaim ever mention a tefillah called Emet V'Yatziv. In fact, they assume that both the morning and the evening have the same bracha, both which start with the words Emet V'Yatziv. Here's an example from the Mishnayot and Brachot, Mishnah Bet, Parak Bet. Elohen ben aprakim ben bracha rishona l'shniya ben shniya l'shema ben shema l'vayim shema ben vayim shema l'VaYomer ben VaYomer l'Emet V'Yatziv. He doesn't say Emet V'Yatziv or Emet VeEmunah. What I forgot to mention here is I did have this slide at the bottom. The Mishnah says clearly VaYomer eno nohega l'bayom. I'm sorry if I didn't show this earlier. I didn't realize I had the slide up. Okay, so if this is the case in Eretz Yisrael, that in Eretz Yisrael they said Emet V'Yatziv by both. Did they do them exactly the same way? The answer is no. In Eretz Yisrael, in the morning they had Emet V'Yatziv, but it continued with Ozer et Avotenu, while in the evening they also began Emet V'Yatziv, but it continued with a section called Ata Hekita. These are two separate two separate mid stanzas. Both of them contain basically the same thing, but they are a difference in Nusach HaKeva. Now, the Gemara in Yerushalmi says something really interesting, which might actually help us understand why the Bnei Eretz Yisrael never said Emet VeEmunah. It says, Rabbi Simon L'Shem Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman Amar Al Shem V'Hegita Bo Yomam V'Layla Shehagayat Hayom V'Halayla Shavim. That the learning of the morning and night should be similar. And to simplify what he's saying here is that the Mishnah that he's explaining is the Mishnah of B'Shachar V'Arach Shtayim L'Faneo V'Achat L'Achareh. The Mishnah discusses how many brachot you say before and after Keriat Shema, and he's trying to explain why by Shachrit you do two before and one after, and by Arvit you do two before and two after. He says, well, because we want symmetry. In the morning where we say VaYomer, that would be 7 parts in total. 2 brachot, 3 parashiot, and then 1, I should say 6 parts in total, and then 1 bracha afterwards. In the evening also, where we don't say VaYomer, we want 6 parts in total. We want 2 brachot, 3 parts of Shmona Esrei, and then 2 parts of Shmona Esrei, and then two brachot afterwards. It's for a symmetry. Because Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman prefers a symmetry to the morning and the evening brachot of Keriat Shema, it is likely that the Bnei Eretz Yisrael believe that the brachot for Keriat Shema should also be symmetrical. They should also begin with Emet V'Yatziv. This is an interesting suggestion. This was made by the Sidur Eretz Yisrael. And the Sidur Eretz Yisrael, I want to show you here. This is one of my favorite books. You could find this online. They have their own website. Essentially, there's a fanatical group of Jews who I think are adorable, which got very into reconstructing the nusach of the kilot of Eretz Yisrael from 1,000 years ago. So since in the past 200 years, there's been a lot of research which has engineered and reverse engineered what it was that they prayed in the communities that followed Talmud Yerushalmi and followed the yeshivot of Eretz Yisrael. They've managed by this point to reconstruct a pretty good picture of what the people in Cairo or similar communities would have been praying had they followed the yeshivot of Eretz Yisrael. And this Siddur Eretz Yisrael is an amazing siddur. It also has a lot of notes on the bottom, which are very helpful if you're studying this field. And I want to read with you the just a comparison between what they do in the morning, what they do in the evening, and how that's similar to um to what we have in the Nusach HaBavli. Let's look at the Nusach of Shachrit, for example. In the Nusach of Shachrit, instead of Ezrat Avotenu, you have Ve'ozert Avotenu Atahu Me'olam Magenu Moshe Levneim Ve'achreim B'chol Dor V'Dor B'rum Olam Moshavecha Mishpatecha V'tzitchatecha Ad Afsei Aretz Emet Ashtei Ish Ish Mitzvotecha V'dvaracha V'chukecha Mishpatecha V'toratecha Yesim Ali Bo. I would read onwards, but I don't really have full time to do the morning one right now. It ends with Raglei Mivaser El Hayarim, the steps of the heralder, the person who's going to herald the Mashiach. Tdalegna will skip. V'tomar Letzion Malach Elokayach Baruch Atah Hashem Suri Yisrael V'Galo. It ends with a different ending that we have in the Bavel. Let's do the night one, because the night one is actually very interesting, since it's kind of very poetic language, but the scholars of this field worked pretty hard on this, and in their opinion, this section, this paragraph called Atakita, is probably not piyut. This is probably a nusach hakeva. So in the beginning, you have like this: Emet v'yatziv v'nachon v'kayam v'yashar v'ne'eman. This is what they did by Arvit, right? They wouldn't say Emet VeEmunah; they would say Emet v'yatziv. Now, the nusach Eretz Yisrael was not the 15 to 17. Emet v'yatziv v'nachon v'kayam v'yashar v'ne'eman v'ahuv v'chaviv v'nechmad. That's not what they would do. They would do 7. They would Emet v'yatziv v'nachon v'kayam v'yashar v'ne'eman v'tov. That was their nusach. And it would go like this: Hadavar azeh aleinu v'avatenu v'baninu v'dorotenu v'kol dorot zeri yisrael abadecha. Harishonim v'achorim la'olam va'ed chok v'lo yavor. They would skip the Emet Alokei Olam, that section that we have in the Bavli, and then it would go straight to Emet Atahu Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu Malkeinu Melech Avotenu Gol Aleinu Gol Avotenu Yotenu Suri Shatenu Podenu Etzleinu Me'olam Shimcha Nekra Aleinu Be'ahava En Elokim Zulatecha. Okay, that basic beginning is the same as the morning. But then comes this middle stanza called Ata Hikita Kol Bechor Be'eretz Mitzrayim Mi Bechor Adam Ad Bechor Behema Ube'elokehem Shivatim Asita Al Odot Yisrael Nachalatecha V'yam Suf Bakata Lefnei Avotenu V'tavireim B'tocho Becherava V'hamayim Hayu Lahem Kichoma. The water was like them for a wall. Miminam Solam, from the right and to their left. V'etrodfei Amecha Kisa Hayam, and those who chased your children, the ocean covered them. Echad mehem lo natar, not even one of them were left. Sham shoreru lach Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. Over there, Moshe and Miriam saying to you, and Aaron, and our forefathers on the Yamsuf praised you and glorified you, etc. Anu v'amru mi kamocha be'kelim Hashem mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh nora atilat osefela machutecha kibulu aleim v'alzam ledorot olam zet sur yeshenu anu, and then they replied v'amru Hashem alkinu melech avotenu melech chai v'kayam shimcha aleinu Hashem melech Hashem malach Hashem imeloch lamed. And again, it ends with a herald for the Mashiach. Yekayem Hashem Elokeinu kibado v'galo v'kedushato kedusha shemo v'yegalenu geula shalema. Hashem should please bring us a geula shalema. Baruch atah Hashem. Tzur Yisrael v'galo. The Chatima was Tzur Yisrael v'galo. So what's really interesting is that if you compare the Nusach HaBavli and the Nusach Yerushalmi, it actually appears that the Nusach Eretz Yisrael is older. Because first of all, the Nusach Eretz Yisrael is more stable, right? It's the same Emet v'Yatziv morning and evening. It skips it skips a couple of the additional components which are only added by the Bavli, and it appears that since it's more skeletal and refined, it does appear that this Nusach HaKeva was probably more original, and Emet VeEmunah was kind of a later, what's it called? I wouldn't call it a modified, but a later alternative to the Ata Hakita version, which was most likely the Nusach, which was said in the time of the Tanaim. Now let's pay attention for a second to this Chatima. Rava said in Bavli that this is in Pesachim Daf Kuf Zayin Amud Bet. Rava says a very famous thing Bechotei Megula. This is talking about the Nusach of Haggadah Shel Pesach, right? We make a bracha for Gula. Amar Rava by Haggadah Shel Pesach. What do? Keriat Shema v'Halel. By Kriyat Shema and Hallel, especially the Hallel of Pesach, we end with a bracha, Baruch Hashem Ga'al Yisrael, who redeemed, in the past tense, Klal Yisrael. Ditzlota, but the bracha at the end of Tefillah, Go El Yisrael, meaning in the bracha of Re'ena Be'onyenu, at the end we say Baruch Hashem Go El Yisrael, Maita Amadra Hameninu, because these are supplications, and because prayer is a supplication for mercy, therefore we say it in the active tense, that Hashem is like Chonen Hadat. He's the one who gives us Rofei Cholei Yisrael, who heals us, Goel Yisrael, who redeems Klal Yisrael, because it's a supplication to Hashem. But when we're talking about Kriyat Shema, where we're remembering it, or in Hallel, where we are remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim, over there we speak about it in the past tense, and we say Ga'al Yisrael. Now this is Rava. Rava was an Amorah in Bavel. This is much later than what we might know from the practice in Eretz Yisrael, which is earlier. Rabbi Shua ben Levi says that the proper ending for this bracha is Sur Yisrael v'Goalo. That for some reason, in Eretz Yisrael, they chose to end with Sur Yisrael v'Goalo. Now it's very similar to a pasuk, I think in Yeshaya. Sur Pasuk says, hold on, Ko Amar Hashem Melech Yisrael v'Goalo. It could be that they're trying to make it similar to that pasuk, but not entirely exactly the same, because you don't want to make the ending of a bracha exactly like a pasuk. Now, interestingly, the Temanim, up until this day, they say at the end of Haggadah Shel Pesach, they say Baruch Atah Hashem Goel Yisrael, and even the old minhag, the baladi of the Temanim, was by Kriyat Shema to also say Baruch Atah Hashem Goel Yisrael. This has added a lot of confusion to scholars who are trying to study this, because there are so many different options for what exactly is going on here. Like Yosef Heinemann and others point out that if it really is in the past tense, you should really say She Ga'al Yisrael or Asher Ga'al et Yisrael, right? Anytime a bracha is ending with is talking about the past tense, like Asher Yatzar Adam, we add an Asher, so it should be Asher Ga'al et Yisrael. So there's been a lot of this seems to be an exception here, that we would put a bracha, that we would have a word here, Ga'al Yisrael, simply in the past tense. It really should be in the active tense. There's been a lot of different suggestions as to how to reconcile this. Some have said that Ga'al Yisrael is like Salach, like Ga'al and a Salach. It's also a noun, that Hashem is the Ga'al, the Redeemer of Yisrael. That's a grammatical, what's the word? Suggestion. Could be. It could be that Rava is only trying to be Machriya, and there were originally so many different practices. Ga'al Yisrael, Rava wanted to make a distinction. He said, okay, for Kriyat Shema and Tefillah, sorry, for Kriyat Shema and Hallel, say Ga'al, and for Tefillah, say Goel. But from the manuscripts, it seems that people were doing both in Eretz Yisrael, and in the Temanim. A lot of people, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what exactly was done throughout the 1,000 years after, what do you call it? For the 1,000 years after Rava. In the Keriat Geniza, we have plenty of cases where there were also manuscripts that say Ga'al Yisrael. So Uri, if anyone's interested, look at Uri Erlich. He has a short, 3-page article on this about, what the manuscripts of the Geniza tell us about Ga'al Yisrael or Goel Yisrael. Okay, I should mention that the Nusach of the Ashkenazim, whenever they do piyutim for the brachot of Keriat Shema, like Arvit, they will the Emet VeEmunah, they will often, because it's an introduction to a piyut, they will say Emet VeEmunah, and they will end Baruch Atah Hashem Tzur Yisrael v'Goalo. The reason being because they are reciting a piyut which was composed in Eretz Yisrael over 1,000 years ago, And if that's where the piyut comes from, it's going to begin with Emet VeEmunah, and it's going to end with Baruch Hashem Tzur Yisrael v'Goalo. That's just the nature of those piyutim because they are ancient and from Eretz Yisrael. Now, I did want to mention that at the end of the Berachot Keriat Shema, they had a minhag to, where were we? Hold on. They had a minhag to end with a herald for the Mashiach. And it is also mirumaz in the nusach of the Bavli. In other words, just like Hashem redeemed us then, so too should he redeem us now. And the suggestion was made, I don't remember by who, but the suggestion was made that this could be because of the Mishnah Brachot. The Mishnah says that the Chachamim understood the mitzvah b'Yetziat Mitzrayim to extend all the way to the days of the Mashiach. Because in the times of the Mashiach, we will also have to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim. And because the Mishnah mentions this halacha, it was important to those who composed, because the Chachamim held that Yetziat Mitzrayim is going to last, the mitzvah of Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim is going to last until the time of Mashiach. It was important to those who created the Nusach HaKeva for this bracha to remind us of the Yemot HaMashiach in the bracha at the end. So I believe with that, wow, we finished a little early. With that, we are complete our discussion of Emet VeEmunah. I hope I've shed some light for anybody who's been looking into this. Is there anything more to cover? The Nusach that most people are familiar with today, I guess like I could mention, is the Nusach HaBavli. The Nusach Ashkenaz and Sfarad of Ashkenaz, and the medieval ones between Ashkenaz and Spain are virtually identical. When you look at the Siddur of Amram Gaon and many of the Gaonic era, and the medieval era texts, most of them are almost identical. The only difference you will find is one sentence in the Siddur of Sadia Gaon. Right? We have in the Siddur of Sadia Gaon, he has one more sentence which is kind of interesting. I'll show it to you now if you've never seen it. And other than that, it's been the same for the past 1,000 years. The Nusach HaBavli, I won't cover tonight because I'm sure everybody's familiar with it. But here, if you go to Siddur of Sadia Gaon, he was from Egypt himself, but the Nusach HaBavli there had something interesting. It says, then here he says, Lecha osef fele, piaru piduyim lishmecha, al sifat hayam, yachad kulam, bikol echad, hodu ve'imlichu v'amru Hashem yimloch la'alam ba'ed. It seems like that's some sort of poetic addition, which seemed to have become a staple of the Nusach HaKeva for the Jews who prayed in Eretz Yisrael, because in Fustat or in Cairo, because the Siddur of Amram Gaon simply doesn't have that. And as far as we know, the Siddur of Sadia was being sent to the Jews of Egypt. So if he's sending it to the Jews of Egypt, he probably meant to give them a Nusach that they should say in Egypt, which would be this. I don't think this was the Nusach of the Yeshivot of Bavel, but besides this lost Nusach here, the Nusach of Emet VeEmunah has remained considerably the same from medieval times all the way until today. So thank you to everybody for your time, for your attention, and Bezrat Hashem, we will continue next week.